The Forgotten Tenants. Sarah stood in the middle of their new apartment, inhaling the scent of dust and old wood. The place was far from perfect, peeling paint on the walls, creaky floorboards, and a musty smell that clung to the air. But for the price they were paying, it was a steal. She turned to Mark, who was struggling to drag the last box through the front door. "I still can't believe we got this place," she said, smiling. "It's so much bigger than what we were expecting." Mark dropped the box by the window and wiped the sweat from his brow. "Yeah, but it needs some work. That kitchen is straight out of the 70s, he joked. "But we'll make it home." As they unpacked, Sarah couldn't help but notice some odd things about the apartment. The door frames had faint, scratched names etched into them, names she didn't recognize. In the closet, there were old clothes, some torn and moth-eaten, left behind as if someone had left in a hurry. An empty leather suitcase sat in the corner of the bedroom, the handle broken off. "They really didn't bother cleaning this place out, did they?" Sarah muttered, tossing the clothes into a trash bag. Later that evening, they were greeted by their neighbor, Mrs. Evans, an elderly woman who lived across the hall. Her face was wrinkled, and her eyes had a sharpness that made Sarah feel slightly uneasy. "You're the new tenants," Mrs. Evans said, peering into the apartment. "I hope you settle in well. Just be careful here." Sarah frowned. "Careful? Of what?" Mrs. Evans hesitated, her bony hand resting on the doorframe. "Strange things happen in this building. People move in, but not all of them move out. The couple before you, young like you, just vanished. No one knows where they went." Mark chuckled nervously. "That's quite the welcome." Mrs. Evans didn't laugh. She simply nodded, her expression grim. "Just keep an eye out." After she left, Sarah shook off the strange conversation. It was probably just the ramblings of a lonely old woman. Still that night, as they lay in bed listening to the creaks and groans of the old apartment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Evans's warning had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. The first few nights were quiet enough. The sounds of the old building, pipes groaning, floorboards creaking under their weight, were easy to explain. Sarah told herself it was just an adjustment period. She'd never lived in a place this old before, and old buildings had their quirks. Mark slept easily, snoring softly beside her, but Sarah found herself lying awake, listening, waiting. On the fourth night, she heard it for the first time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside their bedroom door. She tensed and glanced at the clock. 3:13 a.m. "Mark," she whispered, nudging him. "Did you hear that?" Mark grumbled and rolled over, still half asleep. "It's nothing, Sarah. Probably someone in the building. Go back to sleep." She wanted to believe him, but something about the sound was wrong. The footsteps seemed too close, too distinct, as if someone was standing just outside their door. She held her breath, listening. The steps stopped, and silence fell over the apartment. Sarah waited for a long moment, her heart racing, before finally closing her eyes again. The next night, it happened again. This time, it was louder. The same deliberate footsteps, walking down the hallway outside their bedroom. They stopped just at the door, as if someone was standing there listening. Sarah's pulse quickened. She sat up and looked toward the door. The hallway was dark, but she swore she could feel a presence on the other side. "Mark, wake up," she whispered urgently. Mark groaned, clearly irritated. "It's just the building settling, Sarah. You're imagining things." But she wasn't. She knew what she had heard. The footsteps, the distinct pauses, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't her imagination. The following evening, Sarah found herself alone in the apartment. Mark had gone out to meet a friend, and she tried to distract herself with some unpacking. But as soon as the sun set, that familiar unease returned. She jumped at every creak, every distant sound from the other apartments. And then, just after midnight, it happened again. Footsteps in the hallway, heavy and deliberate. This time Sarah couldn't stay still. She grabbed a flashlight, opened the door, and shined the light down the hallway. Empty. Not a soul in sight. Yet she could still feel it. Someone, or something, had been there. The sleepless nights began to take their toll on Sarah. She found herself tense and on edge during the day, dreading the quiet of the night when the footsteps would return. Mark had grown tired of her constant worry, brushing it off as stress from the move. "You need to relax," he said, sitting down to watch TV while she stood at the window, staring out at the street below. Old buildings make noise. But it wasn't just noise anymore. It felt personal, like someone was deliberately making themselves known. Sarah couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, even during the day. That's when she decided to do some digging. If the footsteps were real, if something was wrong with this building, she needed to know. She started small, asking Mrs. Evans about the couple who had lived there before. They were a lovely pair, Mrs. Evans said, her voice low and hushed, as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. But they were always complaining about strange things, noises, feelings. Then one day, they were gone. No goodbye. Just vanished. That evening, Sarah sat down with her laptop and started researching the building. She didn't expect to find much, but as soon as she typed in the address, a flurry of old news articles popped up. The first was from nearly 30 years ago. A couple reported missing from the same apartment. No signs of foul play, no forced entry. The article described them as normal, with no reason to disappear suddenly. Their belongings were found untouched, as if they had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. Sarah's heart raced as she scrolled through more articles. Every few years, tenants from the same apartment had vanished, each case eerily similar, always young couples, always without warning, and always from the same apartment. None of them were ever found. She clicked on an image from an old article. It showed the missing couple standing in front of the apartment door. The woman was smiling, her hand resting on the door frame, right where Sarah had seen the faint, scratched names. Her hands trembled. Were those the names of the missing tenants? How many people had lived here and disappeared? She realized with a cold certainty the pattern wasn't random. It was happening again. To them. Mark, as usual, dismissed it. But Sarah knew something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. Sarah couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the missing couples, their smiling photos burned into her mind. She needed answers, and there was only one person who seemed to know more than she was letting on. Mrs. Evans. One evening, Sarah knocked on the old woman's door. Mrs. Evans answered slowly, her eyes narrowing when she saw Sarah standing there. "Mrs. Evans, can I talk to you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely hiding the desperation she felt. "I need to know more about the people who used to live here. What really happened to them?" Mrs. Evans hesitated for a moment, her frail fingers gripping the edge of the door. Finally, she nodded and stepped aside, motioning for Sarah to enter. The apartment was dimly lit, filled with old, mismatched furniture and the scent of stale air. Mrs. Evans sat in an armchair, motioning for Sarah to take a seat opposite her. "You're not the first to ask," Mrs. Evans began, her voice low and somber. "But no one ever listens." Sarah leaned in, her heart pounding. "Please, I need to know. What's happening in this building?" Mrs. Evans sighed, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "This place has history, dear. Bad history. It started after the fire." Sarah frowned. "Fire?" Mrs. Evans nodded. "Back in the 1950s, there was a fire in this very building. Several people died, but not all of them were found. The official story was that their bodies were lost in the flames, but that's not the whole truth. Some people believe that the tenants who died never left." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What do you mean, never left?" Mrs. Evans looked into her eyes, her expression grim. The people who disappeared. They didn't just vanish. Something in this building took them, and it's still here. It's drawn to certain people, to certain energies. The young, the hopeful, the ones who don't see it coming. Sarah's stomach twisted. But why? What does it want? The old woman shook her head. I don't know. But I've seen it happen too many times. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched. It's always the same before they go. And once it starts, it doesn't stop. Sarah's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt frozen in place. What happened to the last couple? She whispered. Mrs. Evans stared at her for a long moment before answering. Gone, just like the others. And if you're not careful, it'll happen to you too. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Sarah could barely breathe. You have to get out, dear, Mrs. Evans said, her voice almost a plea, before it's too late. It was just past midnight when Sarah woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Mark wasn't in bed. He'd stayed late at work again, but he always texted when he was on his way home. She checked her phone, expecting his usual "on my way" message. But there was nothing. She dialed his number, listening to the ringing on the other end. No answer. Trying not to panic, she reasoned with herself. He probably got held up with a client, or maybe he'd stopped to grab a drink with his coworkers. But as the minutes ticked by, a growing knot of dread settled in her stomach. At 2 a.m., her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Mark's boss. He hadn't shown up for work that evening. The knot in her stomach tightened into something far worse. She called his friends, anyone who might know where he was, but no one had heard from him. By 3 a.m., Sarah was pacing the apartment, her mind racing. She walked out into the hallway, half expecting to hear the familiar footsteps, but the silence was suffocating. She called the police, explaining the situation in a voice that felt detached from her body. They assured her they would send someone over, but their calm tone only made her feel more frantic. When the officers arrived, they asked the usual questions. When did you last see him? Did he seem upset? Could he have left on his own? But Sarah knew Mark. He wouldn't just leave without saying anything. One officer wandered into the hallway and called her over. Ma'am, is this his phone? He held up Mark's phone, lying face down on the floor just outside the apartment door. It looked like it had been dropped in a rush. The screen cracked. Sarah's heart pounded. Yes, that's his. The officer picked it up carefully, frowning. Strange that it's here. But Sarah barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on the door. A smudged handprint was visible on the inside of the door frame, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't Mark's. She pointed it out to the officer, but he shook his head. Probably just an old mark. This is an old building. But Sarah knew better. She could feel the cold weight of truth settling in. Mark hadn't left on his own. Something had taken him. By the time the officers left, offering little comfort, Sarah was alone in the apartment. And the silence was unbearable. Mark was gone, just like the others. Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mark's phone on the floor, the smudged handprint on the doorframe. It had been 2 days since Mark vanished, and the police had no leads. They treated it like he'd simply walked out on her. The thought made her sick. She knew him. He wouldn't leave her like this. Something had taken him. Desperation drove her back to the internet, combing through articles, old photos, and forgotten records tied to the building. But it wasn't enough. She needed real answers. Sarah hired a private investigator named Tom Richards, a man with a gruff demeanor, but a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found. Richards listened intently as Sarah laid out everything. The missing tenants, the strange noises, Mrs. Evans' cryptic warnings. He didn't seem the type to believe in the paranormal, but Sarah didn't care. She just needed someone to look deeper. I'll start with the building records, see what I can dig up, Richards said. Might be some old disputes with the owner or a connection between the tenants. Days passed. Sarah barely left the apartment, her mind consumed by fear and guilt. Every noise made her flinch. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. She avoided the hallway entirely. One evening, Richards called, his voice tight. "I found something. Meet me at the office." When Sarah arrived, Richards had old black and white photographs spread out across his desk. "These are from the 1980s, he said, pointing to a grainy picture of a tenant meeting. "Notice anything?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. In the background of the photo stood a man who looked exactly like Mark. The resemblance was uncanny. Same build, same face. But the photo was from decades before Mark was born. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, her hand trembling as she picked up the photo. "I thought it was a coincidence," Richards continued. "But look at this." He handed her another photo, this one from the 1960s. In the background, the same man, Mark, was standing near the entrance of the building. Sarah's blood ran cold. "How is this possible? What does this mean?" Richards leaned forward, his face grim. "I don't think Mark was the first person to vanish. And I don't think this thing, whatever it is, just takes people. I think it's been taking them and trapping them somehow, repeating history." Sarah felt the room spin. The photos, the names etched in the door frames, the missing tenants, they were all connected. Mark wasn't just missing. He was part of something much darker, something that had been happening for decades. And Sarah feared she was next. The weight of the photos lingered in Sarah's hands as she stared at the faces of the missing tenants, faces that seemed to repeat across decades. Mark's face, among others, trapped in a time he never lived. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her thoughts were a jumbled mess. How could this be possible? Could something really trap people, forcing them to live through time like this? Richards continued to explain, his tone careful but urgent. "I dug into the building's past, specifically around the fire Mrs. Evans mentioned. It was more than just an accident. The previous owner, Dr. Warren Rook, was conducting experiments on the tenants, some kind of psychological trials. There were rumors of hypnosis, deep therapy sessions meant to unlock memories from past lives." Sarah's stomach churned. What does that have to do with now? That was decades ago. Because the tenants didn't just die, Sarah. Their disappearances. It's like something unfinished was left behind. Rook believed that through his experiments, he could manipulate time or create some loop between life and death. Some of the tenants who vanished back then have reappeared in old photos over the years, like Mark. Sarah's mind reeled. "You're saying they're still here? Trapped in some kind of loop?" Richards nodded slowly. "Not just them. It's anyone who fits the pattern. Young couples, new to the building, vulnerable and hopeful. It's almost like the building is picking its next target. Mark fits the profile. And now it's you." A cold sweat broke across Sarah's skin. The footsteps, the strange noises, they were signs of this loop pulling them in. She remembered Mrs. Evans's warning. The ones who disappear, it doesn't stop until it has who it wants. The footsteps weren't random. They were part of the pattern, a force trying to claim its next victims. And now, without Mark, Sarah realized she was the final piece. "What do I do?" she whispered, barely holding back the panic. "I think there's a way to break it," Richards said, his voice hushed. "I found records of a tenant in the 1970s, a woman who nearly vanished but escaped. She mentioned an apartment on the top floor, a room that's been sealed off since the fire. It's the heart of this. Rook's old study. If we can find it, maybe we can stop this." Sarah's heart raced. "What if I don't? What happens if I don't stop it?" Richards didn't answer right away. He met her gaze, his expression grim. "Then you disappear, like the others, and no one will remember you." Her hands trembled as the weight of his words sank in. She had to act. But deep down, Sarah knew whatever she found in that sealed room might be worse than the footsteps in the hall. The hallway felt longer than usual as Sarah and Richards climbed the stairs to the top floor of the building. The dim lighting flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The building's age seemed to press down on her, every creak of the floorboards reminding her how old and forgotten this place was. She had never been to the top floor before. The tenants rarely mentioned it, and there was a reason. Most of the doors were boarded up, the windows covered with thick layers of dust. As they reached the final landing, Sarah's pulse quickened. The sealed room was just ahead, an old rusted metal door with no number, tucked at the end of the hallway. The air around it felt thick, like it hadn't moved in years. Richards pulled out a crowbar and pried at the door's edges. It groaned under the pressure, the sound echoing down the hall. Finally, with one last effort, the door gave way, opening to reveal a dark, untouched space. The room was small and cluttered with old furniture, dusty bookshelves, and faded papers scattered across the floor. But in the center stood a large wooden desk, its surface covered in yellowed documents and what looked like medical instruments, tools used for experiments Sarah couldn't even begin to imagine. "This is where it all started," Richards muttered, stepping inside. Sarah hesitated at the doorway, her eyes darting around the room. She could feel it, the heaviness, the lingering presence of something that didn't belong to this world. The same oppressive force she'd felt in her apartment, the one that had taken Mark. On the desk was a journal, its cover cracked and brittle with age. Sarah opened it, her fingers shaking. The first page was covered in Dr. Warren Rook's handwriting, describing his experiments in meticulous detail. He had believed that through hypnosis and psychological manipulation, he could trap souls between life and death, creating a space where time folded in on itself. A loop. Her heart pounded as she flipped through the pages. Names of the missing tenants were scrawled in the margins. And then she found Mark's name, written at the bottom of the last entry. A chill washed over her. Mark had been claimed by the loop, but there was a final note, a small, hastily scribbled message. The loop can be broken if the chain is severed at its source. Richards pointed to a small trapdoor in the corner of the room. "I think that's where we need to go." Sarah hesitated but followed him to the door. Beneath it, they found a hidden compartment filled with burnt photographs and more names etched into the wood. Among them was an old photograph of Dr. Rook himself, standing with his last patient. The resemblance to Mark was striking. "This is the link," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. She grabbed the photograph and, without thinking, tore it in half. The room seemed to shudder, and a gust of cold air rushed through the space, extinguishing the lingering darkness. Suddenly, Sarah felt the weight lift. The room was silent, peaceful. She turned to Richards, her chest heaving. "It's over," she said, barely believing it herself. But in her heart, she knew Mark was gone forever, lost to a history she could never change. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos.